If you were to walk through the soft dust of the Nile Delta around 2400 BCE, your sandals brushing against reeds and your ears filled with the faint hum of cicadas, you might not yet know the name Isis. She was not yet the grandmother goddess, the patroness of magic, the figure who would later conquer the imagination of Rome and beyond. She was still a local deity, tied to the river and the soil, a whisper in the prayers of farming women who hoped for healthy children and an abundant flood. Egypt, by that time, was already old. The pyramids of Giza stood silent and massive under the sun. Kings had been entombed, dynasties had risen and fallen, and yet daily life went on much as it always had. The measured rhythm of sowing, waiting, and harvesting, the long anticipation of the Nile's rise each year. The people had 1,000 small gods to thank for every turn of fortune, gods of fish, gods of air, gods of door hinges and pots. But among them, one small household spirit, a woman with a throne for a headdress, began to gather quiet attention. Her name was Aset to the Egyptians, later Isis to the Greeks. The stories of her birth are vague, as many old gods' origins are. She was said to be the sister and wife of Osiris, the god of fertility and kingship. Yet long before the elaborate myths took shape, Isis was something simpler and more profound, the embodiment of ideal womanhood. Devoted, clever, and enduring. She represented the kind of quiet strength that held villages together during the long, hot months when the riverbed cracked and fish rotted in the shallows. In the earliest texts, such as the pyramid texts of the 5th and 6th dynasties, Isis appears not as a celestial being, but as a mourner, a grieving wife who seeks the scattered pieces of her husband's body. The myth would later expand into one of Egypt's most powerful religious stories, Osiris slain by his jealous brother Set, his body dismembered and scattered across the land, and Isis, undeterred, searching every corner of the two lands to gather him back together. But what mattered most to the Egyptians was not just her love or persistence. It was her mastery of ritual. She, through her knowledge of secret names and incantations, was the first to bring life back to death. To the Egyptians, that knowledge was everything. Power did not come from strength or wealth alone, but from knowing the right words at the right time. The Heka, or magic, was a kind of cosmic language, and Isis was said to speak it fluently. When she raised Osiris from death, she taught humanity that life and death were not final opposites, but cyclical phases, as reliable and mysterious as the Nile's annual flood. Over time, Isis became not just the wife of a god, but the prototype of motherhood itself. She was called She of 10,000 Names, a title that reflected her ability to be whatever her devotees needed: healer, protector, midwife, magician. Her temples began to multiply, spreading from the delta down through Upper Egypt. The earliest centers of her worship were small and practical, little shrines near fields or beside canals, where farmers left offerings of milk, bread, or carved amulets. The incense burned slowly, and priests in white linen chanted in voices trained for repetition and calm, their hymns more like waves lapping against a shore than songs of praise. These temples were not places of spectacle but of routine, a kind of sacred bureaucracy that mirrored Egypt itself. Every morning, the priests would enter the inner sanctum to wake the statue of Isis. They washed her with perfumed water, anointed her with oil, and dressed her in clean linen. They offered her bread, fruit, and wine, all while reciting formulaic prayers copied from generations of scribes. Each action, however minor, had to be precise. The rituals were designed not to impress but to maintain balance. Mat, the principle of cosmic order. That was Egypt's secret, an entire civilization built on routine. The same ceremonies repeated for centuries, the same prayers written on tomb walls, the same careful tending of fields and irrigation channels. To the modern mind, this may seem dull, but to the Egyptians, repetition was power. If the world was stable, it meant the gods were pleased. If the Nile flooded on time, if the bread rose properly, if the household remained intact, Isis was watching. Isis's image changed over the centuries, but certain symbols remained constant. She was almost always shown wearing a throne-shaped crown, a sign of her role as the seat of the king's power. Later, she was depicted nursing her infant son Horus, a scene that resonated so deeply that it would echo in Christian iconography millennia later. Sometimes she held an ankh, the sign of life, and a scepter, and sometimes she spread her wings protectively over the dead, her feathers carved with exquisite detail on sarcophagi and temple walls. By the Middle Kingdom, roughly between 2000 and 1700 BCE, Isis had grown far beyond a local deity. She had become a national goddess associated with kingship and the afterlife. Pharaohs invoked her name in funerary texts, and women whispered it during childbirth. In many ways, she was the spiritual heart of Egypt, the link between the ordinary and the divine. Her cult spread through priests, merchants, and the endless migration of ideas along the Nile. As Egypt traded with Nubia, Byblos, and the Aegean, travelers carried her image and her myths across borders. By the time of the New Kingdom, around 1500 BCE, her temples rivaled those of Amun and Ra. Yet unlike those more solar, masculine gods, Isis's appeal was intimate. She did not rule from the sky, she listened from the hearth. Even as empires rose and collapsed, the idea of Isis remained constant, an anchor in a world of shifting sands. Her name was inscribed on amulets worn by fishermen and pharaohs alike. Her story, endlessly retold, spoke to the universal human need for restoration, the hope that broken things could be made whole again. The priests who tended her shrines understood that her power lay not in spectacle, but in familiarity. The daily rituals, bathing the statue, lighting the incense, reciting the hymns, were not meant to entertain, they were meant to sustain, to keep the world, quite literally, from unraveling. But as centuries passed and foreign rulers began to take interest in Egypt, Hyksos invaders from the north, Nubian kings from the south, and later, Persians and Greeks, Isis's image began to shift again. Each culture saw something different in her. To the Greeks, she was Demeter and Aphrodite combined, the mother and the lover, the magician and the mourner. Her temples began to take on new architectural styles, her hymns were translated, and her festivals, once simple village rites, grew into great public ceremonies filled with processions, music, and offerings. And so the question emerges, one that scholars still debate today: how did a local river goddess become the most enduring female deity of the ancient world? A figure worshipped from Egypt to Rome, from Alexandria to the British Isles. What quiet transformation, carried by merchants and priests, turned her from a whisper beside the Nile into a global voice of devotion? That, perhaps, is the true mystery of Isis. Not her myths of magic and resurrection, but the slow, almost invisible spread of belief across time. The way an idea, once born in the mud of the Nile, could drift like pollen across the world. By the time the New Kingdom dawned, sometime around 1550 BCE, Egypt had grown into an empire. Its borders stretched deep into Nubia and far into the Levant. Gold, incense, and cedar wood flowed into Thebes and Memphis. The temples glowed in the sun, painted with scenes of victory and offering. And among the many names chanted in the morning rituals, Amin, Ra, Horus, Hathor, the name of Isis was spoken more and more often. Her worship, once local and domestic, began to take on a national rhythm. The pharaohs of the 18th and 19th dynasties invoked her as the mother of kings, the protector of the divine bloodline. In temple walls and papyrus hymns, she was called the Great of Magic, Mistress of the House of Life, and she who knows all that is. Yet even as her cult was formalized by the priests, she remained a goddess of the people. Farmers still carved her symbol onto jars, midwives still whispered her name over the cries of newborns. To understand how Isis spread, you must imagine Egypt not as a static land of pyramids, but as a living artery. The Nile, pulsing with trade, gossip, and prayer. Every boat that drifted from Memphis to Thebes carried not only cargo but stories. The priests who traveled between temples shared rituals, hymns, and charms. The merchants who traded in papyrus and linen brought her amulets along with them. Slowly, almost invisibly, the goddess moved. By the late New Kingdom, Isis was no longer bound to one region. Her temples could be found near the gold mines of Nubia, the oases of the Western Desert, and the ports along the Mediterranean. The Egyptians built shrines for her near fishing villages, desert roads, and fortress towns. She was becoming omnipresent, not in a dramatic way, but through the persistence of daily worship, the quiet repetition of her name in every corner of the land. Her image too began to change. Artists depicted her as a woman with wings outstretched, her feathers spanning the width of tomb walls, offering protection to the dead. Sometimes she appeared nursing her son, Horus, an image of maternal devotion that struck a deep chord in the Egyptian heart. Even the great gods Ra and Amun could seem distant or abstract, but Isis was immediate, human, and tender. The myth of Isis and Osiris deepened in this period. It became the central story of Egyptian theology, the cycle of death and rebirth that explained everything from the setting sun to the flooding Nile. According to the myth, Osiris, murdered by his brother Set, was restored to life by Isis through her magic. Their union produced Horus, who avenged his father and became king. Every pharaoh was seen as a living Horus, and thus a child of Isis. To be ruled by the son of Isis was to live under her protection. To live under her protection was to belong to the eternal rhythm of renewal. In the temple rituals, these ideas took on a physical form. Every day at dawn, the priests performed the opening of the mouth ceremony on the statues of Isis and Osiris. This ancient rite was meant to restore life to divine images, ensuring that the gods could breathe, eat, and hear the prayers of their devotees. The air in the sanctuaries would fill with the scent of incense, frankincense from Punt, myrrh from the southern lands, and the low hum of chants written thousands of years earlier. Outside, the ordinary Egyptians carried on with their days. They plowed fields, baked bread, and fetched water from the river. But in their daily routines, traces of the goddess lingered. The Heka magic of Isis was not confined to temples. Her spells and prayers appeared on amulets, ostraca, and household objects. Small bronze figures of her nursing Horus were common in homes. Her magic was domestic, meant for healing, protection, fertility, and love. During childbirth, women invoked Isis to ease the pain. They called her Isis, the great mother of the gods, lady of the sky, mistress of the elements. Midwives might draw her symbol in the dust or tie a string of beads around the mother's wrist, murmuring a line from the ancient Book of the Dead. In this way, religion and daily life were one, inseparable and cyclical. As Egypt entered the late period, roughly around 700 BCE, waves of foreign powers began to sweep over the land. Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, each took the throne in turn. Yet remarkably, Isis endured. Her cult not only survived but adapted. She became the goddess who transcended kings. The more Egypt changed, the more her followers clung to her image of constancy. When the Persians ruled, she was the protector of Egyptian identity. When the Greeks arrived with Alexander the Great, she became a bridge between worlds. The Greeks, familiar with their own pantheon of Olympian gods, saw in Isis the reflection of their great mothers and lovers, Demeter, Aphrodite, even Hera. They admired her mystery and her wisdom. Under the Ptolemies, the Greek rulers who followed Alexander, the cult of Isis entered a new golden age. The most famous of her temples from this period was on the island of Philae, near the southern border of Egypt. Surrounded by blue waters and lotus blooms, Philae became known as the Pearl of the Nile. Pilgrims came from every corner of the Mediterranean to offer prayers. The temple complex, begun in the 3rd century BCE and expanded over centuries, was both Greek and Egyptian in style, a symbol of cultural fusion. The rituals at Philae were elaborate yet soothingly predictable. The priests tended to the goddess in strict order: purification, incense, hymns, offerings, and processions. Visitors described the steady rhythm of drums and the rustle of linen robes, the faint flicker of oil lamps reflected on polished stone walls. Even the silence between chants had meaning, a measured quiet meant to honor the divine. Isis's reach extended far beyond the Nile during this time. Her cult spread across the Hellenistic world, to Syria, Cyprus, Greece, and eventually to Rome itself. The merchants and soldiers who traveled through Alexandria carried her image, sometimes carved in ivory or painted on small wooden panels. They built sanctuaries for her in port cities, where sailors prayed for safe voyages and calm seas. In Rome, she became Isis Pelagia, the goddess of navigation, her image placed on ships' prows. In Athens, she was worshipped as a goddess of wisdom and motherhood. In Sicily and Spain, her festivals marked the change of seasons. Everywhere she went, her character absorbed local colors. Yet the essence remained: she who restores, who protects, who endures. It's strange to think how seamlessly her worship adapted to foreign lands. Unlike many Egyptian gods who were bound to specific places or functions, Isis seemed infinitely flexible. She could be mother, queen, magician, or sea goddess. She could comfort women in childbirth, guide sailors through storms, and offer salvation to the dead. To her followers, she was not bound by borders or language. By the 1st century BCE, Isis had become truly global. Her cult rivaled the state religion of Rome itself. Temples to her stood in Pompeii, Corinth, and even in London. The Roman poet Apuleius, in his Metamorphoses, described a vision of her in which she appeared and declared, "I am nature, the universal mother, mistress of all the elements, the single manifestation of all gods and goddesses that are." This was a remarkable transformation for a goddess who had once been little more than a whisper by the Nile. And yet, within Egypt, her temples still functioned as they always had. The priests still rose before dawn. The same chants were still recited. The same offerings still placed before her statue. The cult's power lay not in conquest but in endurance, in the quiet repetition of ritual that spanned 3 millennia. At Philae, travelers wrote of the sound of the water lapping against the island's stones as priests processed through the courtyards. The torches flickered, the lotus columns cast long shadows, and the image of the goddess, serene and eternal, glowed faintly in the inner chamber. Her followers believed she could hear every prayer carried by the wind, every whisper from the river's edge. But even as her fame spread, subtle changes began to appear, hints of tension between her universal appeal and the political realities of empire. Rome tolerated her worship, but uneasily. The emperors feared her mystery cults and their secret initiations. Temples were sometimes closed, only to reopen again under popular pressure. Her image was beloved but also suspect, too powerful, too foreign, too feminine. Still, the faithful continued. The priests of Philae kept the lamps burning even after Christianity began to spread across Egypt. For them, Isis was not an idol but a constant, the living memory of Egypt itself. Yet history moves quietly, and sometimes all that endures is a whisper. So, when the last priest of Philae performed the morning ritual, perhaps sometime in the 6th century CE, long after the temples of other gods had fallen silent, what must he have thought? Did he know he was part of the last generation to speak her name in ritual? Did he sense that the prayers, so carefully preserved through millennia, were about to vanish into the dust? The goddess of 1,000 names had survived empire after empire. But how long could any faith, no matter how sacred, outlast the silence that history brings? When the sun rose over Philae for the last time as a place of worship, the light was no different than it had been for thousands of years. The river still glittered, the reeds still swayed, and the island still held its quiet hum of life. Yet beneath that surface, the world had changed. Egypt, once the heartbeat of the ancient world, now lived under the rule of Rome, and then Byzantium. The old gods had not vanished overnight. They had simply grown quieter, overshadowed by new faiths and new empires. Isis, who had once ruled hearts from Alexandria to London, faced a slow eclipse. Not a dramatic fall, but a gentle, inevitable fading. The kind of decline that happens not with rebellion, but with forgetfulness. The earliest centuries of the Common Era saw her temples still active across the Mediterranean. Pilgrims came, merchants left offerings, and priests still recited hymns older than any empire. In Rome, her festivals were celebrated with processions through the streets, music, incense, and the scent of rose petals. Her worship had become deeply emotional, promising not just protection but personal salvation. But with the rise of Christianity, the world's axis began to shift. The new faith, born in the eastern provinces of the empire, spread with astonishing speed. To its followers, the old gods were no longer divine. They were remnants of ignorance, even demons. Isis, with her symbols of magic and motherhood, came under suspicion. Temples were closed, their statues hidden or defaced. Yet her image did not truly vanish, it transformed. It is one of history's quietest continuities that the early Christians, especially in Egypt, found in Isis a reflection of their new beliefs. The image of Isis nursing Horus had been ubiquitous for over a millennium. In churches and catacombs, this image reappeared. The mother and child, serene and luminous, now called Mary and Jesus. Art historians still debate whether this resemblance was deliberate. But for ordinary people, the continuity was natural. The comfort they once found in the gentle gaze of Isis now found expression in the Virgin Mary. The Divine Mother remained, only her name changed. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the cult of Isis continued longer than almost any other pagan faith. The island of Philae became her final refuge, a small, green jewel in the southern Nile, surrounded by cliffs and temples. Even as Christianity spread through the cities, Philae remained stubbornly devoted to the old ways. The priests there maintained the daily rituals, lighting lamps and offering incense as their ancestors had done for centuries. Travelers from the north spoke of the persistence of these rites. Roman officials tried repeatedly to suppress them, but the local Nubian kings protected the island. It was a borderland, both geographically and spiritually, the meeting place of old and new, of gods fading and gods ascendant. Sometime around the year 537 CE, under the reign of Emperor Justinian, the final decree came. The temples at Philae were to be closed, the idols removed, the priests dismissed. A general named Narses was sent to enforce the order. The last priests of Isis were taken to Alexandria. The sacred statues were shipped to Constantinople. The cult that had endured for over 3,000 years came to its end, at least officially. And yet the end was not as final as it might seem. Across Egypt, in villages and households, people still whispered her name. The folk traditions of the Nile carried echoes of Isis long after her temples fell silent. The rituals of blessing water, the songs sung during harvest, the protective amulets worn by mothers, all bore traces of her ancient magic. Even in the Christian era, these customs endured quietly, woven into new meanings. The Coptic Church adopted certain festivals that once belonged to Isis. the processions along the river, the offerings of flowers and bread. The rhythms of Egyptian spirituality proved impossible to erase. They simply changed their form. When Arab travelers reached Egypt in the 7th century, they found a land still haunted by its ancient faith. They wrote of abandoned temples and crumbling statues, of peasants who spoke of spirits by the river, and of a lady who once ruled the land of the dead. The name Isis had faded, but her memory lingered like the scent of incense in stone. The goddess of 1,000 names had, in a sense, gained one more: memory itself. It is easy to imagine the last day at Philae. The air thick with heat, the waters of the Nile reflecting the light like molten glass. The priests moving in slow procession through the colonnade, their sandals whispering against the flagstones. The chants rising, steady and low. Isis, great in magic, mistress of heaven, mother of the gods. Perhaps they knew this was the end. Perhaps they did not. The rituals were never meant to stop, and so they performed them as they always had. The lamps were lit, the statue washed and anointed, the hymns recited in the same unwavering tone. When the last chant faded into silence, the temple became still. The wind moved through the columns, and the birds returned to their nests. Centuries later, when European explorers rediscovered Philae, they found its sanctuaries half buried in sand. The colors on the walls were still faintly visible. Scenes of Isis with Horus on her lap, Osiris beside her, and priests presenting offerings of bread and lotus flowers. The inscriptions were still legible: prayers for protection, spells for resurrection, words of gratitude for the mother who never abandoned her children. When the temple was cleared and studied, archaeologists noticed something remarkable. Despite the passage of centuries, there was evidence that people had continued to leave offerings. Flowers, small coins, traces of oil. The cult may have ended by law, but devotion does not vanish by decree. The story of Isis is not one of tragedy, but of endurance. No other goddess from antiquity survived so long or traveled so far. Her worship spanned continents and epochs, crossing linguistic and cultural barriers effortlessly. She was Egyptian, Greek, Roman, African, and Mediterranean all at once. Her persistence reveals something profound about humanity itself, our desire to believe in care, restoration, and continuity. Isis represented the assurance that what is broken can be made whole again, that death is not the end, and that love, even divine love, is expressed not in power, but in patience. In her myths, she searched the world for the scattered body of her husband. In history, her spirit seems to have done the same, gathering fragments of herself wherever people sought comfort, finding new forms in new ages. Today, the temple of Isis at Philae has been relocated, stone by stone, to the nearby island of Agilkia, rescued from the rising waters of the Aswan High Dam. Visitors walk among its colonnades, hearing the echo of birds and wind. The carvings still show her face, calm, symmetrical, eternal. Most tourists pass through quickly, pausing for photographs before moving on. But if you linger long enough, you can feel something quieter beneath the surface. The rhythm of footsteps, the warmth of the stone, the faint smell of river water and sand, they all belong to a world that once believed in her completely. It is not difficult to imagine that, somewhere in that stillness, the old prayers remain. Not in the words themselves, but in the feeling of them. The repetition, the order, the quiet maintenance of balance. Even now, in the hush of the evening, when the light fades over the Nile, the air feels heavy with her presence. Not as a deity demanding worship, but as a memory, a shape in the long continuity of human faith. Civilizations rise and vanish, but their prayers rarely disappear entirely. They settle, like dust, into the corners of time. And perhaps that is where Isis remains, not in marble or meth, but in the endless human habit of hoping for renewal, of searching, patiently, for the scattered pieces of what we love, and bringing them back together again. So the story of Isis ends as it began, in silence and in devotion, in the rhythm of life and death that the Nile once marked so faithfully. She was never truly forgotten. She simply changed her name as she always had, and waited. If Isis was the mother who comforted, Hathor was the mother who delighted. She was the laughter in the morning, the shimmer on the river, the sound of music echoing through the courtyards of ancient Thebes. Her temples were not places of mourning but of beauty, music, and abundance. In the old inscriptions, she was called Mistress of Jubilation, Lady of Drunkenness, the Golden One, and, most tenderly, Mistress of the West, she who welcomed the dead into paradise. To the Egyptians, she was both cow and woman, both mother and lover, both fierce and soft. She was the goddess of music, dance, fertility, perfume, and joy, the bright side of the sun. And yet, like all Egyptian deities, she carried in her smile a shadow, The Egyptians understood that joy and destruction were never far apart. But before she became the celestial goddess of love, she was something far simpler, the spirit of the sky itself. In the earliest myths, the sun god Ra sailed across her body every day from east to west. Her eyes were the stars, and her milk nourished the world. She was a vast, cosmic figure, both nurturing and protective. Over time, as Egyptian religion grew more complex, this vastness condensed into intimacy. Hathor became the goddess of women, of mirrors, of perfume, and of the heart's small pleasures. If you had lived in Egypt during the Middle Kingdom, perhaps around 1900 BCE, and walked into one of her temples, you would have noticed how different it felt from others. Temples of Amun or Ra were solemn, geometrical, built for precision and power. Hathor's were fragrant, filled with music. At Dendera, her most famous sanctuary, the air was thick with the scent of burning myrrh and blue lotus. The walls shimmered with carvings of dancers and musicians, and the ceiling, painted deep blue, showed her as the celestial cow, her body arched across the heavens. Priests and priestesses tended to her daily, but so did musicians, perfumers, and artisans. Hathor's temple was not just a place of prayer, it was a center of sensory experience. Music was sacred to her. The sistrum, a kind of rattle made of bronze or gold, was her symbol. When shaken, it made a soft, ringing sound, like sunlight breaking through leaves. The vibration was said to please the goddess and awaken her joy. During festivals, the sound of hundreds of sistrums could be heard for miles. A shimmering, metallic murmur that mingled with the laughter of women and the bleating of cattle in the fields. Wine, too, was sacred to her, not because of intoxication itself, but because of what it symbolized: the release of tension, the joy of letting go. Each year, at the festival of drunkenness, Egyptians celebrated the myth of Hathor's rage and renewal, a story that captures the paradox at the heart of her divinity. The tale, preserved in fragments of papyri and temple inscriptions, begins with the sun god Ra growing old and weary. Humanity, it is said, began to mock him, forgetting their reverence. In his anger, Ra sent his eye, a goddess of vengeance, to punish them. The eye took the form of Hathor, but as she descended upon the earth, her joy turned to fury. She became Sekhmet the lioness, and her wrath was terrible. The rivers ran red, and humanity trembled. When Ra saw the destruction, he regretted his decision. To save what remained of humankind, he ordered that thousands of jars of beer be mixed with pomegranate juice to resemble blood and poured across the fields. Hathor, still in her lioness form, drank the mixture and grew drunk, forgetting her rage. She awoke calm and gentle again. Her destructive fire turned once more into warmth and laughter. Every year, this event was reenacted in temples across Egypt. Men and women gathered to drink, dance, and play music, not in wild chaos, but in ritual joy. The priests called it the Festival of Drunkenness, though it was as much about renewal as celebration. The people believed that through laughter and song, the balance of the world, Maat, was restored. At Dendera, the festival lasted several days. Visitors came by boat, their sails painted with bright colors, the river glittering with the reflection of hundreds of lamps. They brought offerings of flowers, bread, and perfume. They sang hymns that praised the goddess's beauty and her compassion. Hathor, who shines upon all faces, who fills the hearts of women and men, whose fragrance awakens the gods, whose music heals the weary soul. Perfume was another of her gifts. The Egyptians were masters of scent making, and their craft was tied deeply to religion. The perfumers of Dendera mixed oils from myrrh, cinnamon, blue lotus, and frankincense, blending them with fat and beeswax to create thick, aromatic ointments. These were used not only in worship but also in daily life, to soften the skin, to honor guests, and to accompany the dead into eternity. To make perfume was a sacred act. It required patience, precision, and silence. The temple workshops were quiet places, filled with the scent of warm resin and crushed petals. The recipes were written on papyri, passed down for generations. Some ingredients came from Nubia or Punt, carried on camel caravans or ships across the Red Sea. To the Egyptians, each scent had meaning, not just beauty, but memory and magic. Hathor was the patron of these arts. She was called Mistress of Perfume, Lady of Malachite, and She Who Embellishes the Sky. Her image often appeared in cosmetic palettes, jewelry, and mirrors, everyday objects that connected beauty with divinity. In her beauty was not vanity but harmony, the reflection of divine order in human form. The temple at Dendera also functioned as a medical and astronomical center. Its priests studied the stars, believing that Hathor's eyes watched over the heavens. In the ceilings of her sanctuary, constellations were carved in vivid detail. Even the goddess's celestial cow form mirrored the Milky Way, which the Egyptians imagined as a river of milk flowing through the sky. To sleep beneath such a ceiling was to dream within eternity. At night, when the temple gates closed and the priests withdrew to their quarters, the sound of insects and the slow rush of the river filled the air. The lamps flickered on the polished limestone, and the scent of oil and honey drifted through the corridors. The goddess, sealed in her inner chamber, was believed to rest, not as a lifeless statue, but as a living presence. Each morning she would be awakened, washed, and dressed again in ritual. The calm precision of this daily rhythm defined Egyptian religion. Each act of devotion, whether tending a flame, grinding herbs, or chanting a hymn, reaffirmed the connection between humans and gods. The priests believed that if these small tasks were performed correctly, the universe would remain in balance. But even amidst the order, there was tenderness. Hathor's priests and priestesses were not austere theologians but caretakers of joy. They danced, sang, and poured wine. They comforted mourners and blessed the newly married. They embodied the belief that pleasure, too, was sacred. Her reach extended beyond Egypt's borders. The turquoise mines of Sinai, crucial to Egypt's wealth, were considered sacred to Hathor. Miners prayed to her before descending into the harsh, sun-blasted valleys. They left carvings in the rock, crude yet heartfelt, thanking her for safe return. Hathor, Lady of Turquoise, they called her, protector of those who risked their lives for beauty. Even in the most remote deserts, her presence lingered. In the glitter of blue, green stones, in the shimmer of heat over the sand, in the laughter of workers at the end of a long day. And so she became, over time, not just the goddess of joy, but the embodiment of resilience, the ability to find beauty even in toil, to see light even in the glare of the desert. But what happens when a goddess of joy must face sorrow? When a civilization that once sang her name begins to fall silent? As the centuries turned, and foreign powers entered Egypt, Hathor's smile remained, but her temples began to change. Her face still adorned the capitals of columns, serene and unbothered, yet the songs that once filled the halls grew softer. The people still came, still offered perfume and flowers. Yet there was a new uncertainty in the air, the faint awareness that the old ways were slipping, that the sun itself might someday shine on a world that no longer remembered her name. And so we are left with a question: can joy itself, divine, radiant, and ephemeral, survive the slow passage of forgetting? In the stillness of dawn, before the sun rose over the limestone cliffs of Upper Egypt, a soft sound stirred the temple. It was not a chant or a drumbeat, but the faint whisper of fabric, the brushing of reed sandals against stone. The temple women, musicians, dancers, and attendants of Hathor moved through the corridors carrying trays of lotus blossoms and jars of milk. The air smelled faintly of incense and crushed petals. Every morning began this way. The ritual was centuries old. At its center was the awakening of the goddess. To the Egyptians, a temple was not a building. It was a living body, and the statue of the god within it was the heart. When the temple doors were opened at sunrise, it was as though the cosmos itself had been reborn. The women began by cleansing the goddess's image. They poured cool water from silver ewers, washed the statue with linen cloths, and anointed it with oils scented with cinnamon and frankincense. Then came the dressing layer upon layer of fine linen, threaded with gold and beads of turquoise. Hathor's face, carved serene and smiling, was dusted with powdered malachite, and a small mirror was placed before her so she might see her own reflection. This mirror was sacred. In its polished surface, the Egyptians saw the portal between the human and divine worlds. The mirror did not just reflect light, it caught the essence of the sun. To hold a mirror before Hathor was to offer her the warmth of her own radiance. When the preparations were done, the musicians began to play. The sistrums shimmered, the drums beat softly, and voices rose in gentle harmony. These were not performances but invocations. Sound itself was an offering. The priests believed that the vibrations pleased the goddess, keeping the world in balance. Among the temple musicians were women from all walks of life. Some were daughters of priests or officials. Others were gifted commoners who had been brought into temple service for their skill or beauty. To serve Hathor was an honor, but it was also a vocation, one that required discipline, modesty, and grace. They were known as the shimmer, those who sing. Their role was both spiritual and emotional. In festivals, they led the songs that opened the hearts of the people. In funerals, they sang laments to guide souls into the afterlife. Through their voices, Hathor spoke, as mother, as lover, as comforter. One fragmentary hymn from Dendera, carved faintly into a wall, reads, "Sing to her, O women of joy, For she awakens the sleepers, she brings fragrance to the weary, she fills the hearts with gladness. Her laughter is the perfume of the sky. It is impossible to say who composed those words. Perhaps it was a young musician, kneeling before the goddess one dawn, her fingers trembling as she pressed the chisel to the limestone. Or perhaps it was dictated by a priest long gone, his name erased by time. What remains is the voice, soft, reverent, alive. The daily rituals of Dendera reflected the Egyptian view of divinity as partnership. The gods required care, and humans found purpose in providing it. This balance was not subservience, but harmony, Mat, the eternal order. Hathor's joy was not wild or careless, it was structured joy, born from rhythm and repetition. Still, outside the temple walls, joy was not always easy to find. The land was harsh, the river unpredictable. Droughts, invasions, and illness were constants. Yet through it all, the cult of Hathor endured, a kind of defiance against despair. For the women of Egypt, in particular, Hathor offered something rarer: recognition. She was not a distant, stern deity, but one who shared their experiences of love, childbirth, music, and loss. Her temples were among the few places where women could hold formal roles in ritual life. They composed hymns, mixed perfumes, and even interpreted dreams. One Ostracan found near Dendera a small shard of pottery inscribed in ink, records a prayer from an unknown woman. Hathor, who listens, take pity on your servant. My child is ill, my house is poor, yet I offer you milk and song. There is no record of the outcome, no note of whether the goddess answered. But the fact that this fragment survived for over 3,000 years, fragile, ordinary, and deeply human, speaks to the quiet persistence of faith. Hathor's association with milk ran deep. In myth, she was the celestial cow whose milk nourished the world. In life, milk was both sustenance and offering, poured upon altars, mixed into perfumes, and left in bowls before her image. For new mothers, Hathor was invoked as protector and healer. Amulets carved in her likeness, small cows with human faces, were worn around the necks of women in labor. The goddess was said to appear in dreams, offering comfort or guidance. In some stories, she stood at the threshold between life and death, welcoming the departed with open arms. Mistress of the West, the inscriptions called her, the one who greeted the souls as the sun set beyond the horizon. Even death, in her presence, was softened. During the Greco-Roman period, when Egypt came under foreign rule, Dendera remained a place of pilgrimage. The old hymns were translated into Greek. Hathor was equated with Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. Though her name changed, her essence endured. In those later centuries, travelers from distant lands visited her temple. Some came seeking blessings for fertility, others for safe journeys. They left small offerings, coins, figurines, terracotta lamps. The priests recorded their names on the walls, adding them to the long lineage of devotion. Among the most remarkable features of the Dendera temple is its ceiling, vast blue, and covered in celestial carvings. There among the constellations is the famous Dendera zodiac, depicting the stars as animals, boats, and gods. The Egyptians did not see astronomy as separate from religion. To chart the heavens was to understand the divine. Hathor's eyes, they believed, were the sun and the moon themselves, ever watching, ever benevolent. When modern archaeologists uncovered this temple in the 19th century, they found traces of color still clinging to the carvings. Blues, reds, and golds, faded but not gone. Imagine that moment after millennia of darkness, the first light touching those painted faces again. Hathor's smile, serene and faint, re-emerging into the modern world. What is striking is not just the art, but the atmosphere it conveys. The columns, each crowned with Hathor's face, all bear the same gentle expression. Not pride, not power, but peace. She does not demand fear, she invites calm. In that way, the temple itself seems almost like a lullaby, a song of continuity amid change. Even as empires rose and fell, as new gods replaced old, the essence of Hathor lingered. The music of her festivals faded, but the idea of her, the divine as joy, as tenderness, remained woven into Egyptian culture, even under the surface of later religions. And perhaps that is her true legacy. Not conquest, not miracles, but something subtler, the endurance of joy, the belief that even in hardship, beauty has a place, that laughter like sunlight can sanctify the ordinary. Centuries later, when travelers walked through the ruins of Dendera under moonlight, they described feeling a strange warmth, a presence that could not be named. The wind whispered through the stone halls, stirring the scent of dust and desert flowers. Somewhere far off, the river murmured. And in that silence, it was easy to imagine her still there, the Lady of Joy, her golden head tilted slightly, listening. When the Greek rulers came to Egypt, They brought with them a new language, new gods, and new ways of thinking. But in the warm light of the Nile, even the conquerors found themselves softened. The land had a way of folding strangers into its rhythm, turning them, over time, into Egyptians. So it was with Hathor. The Greeks called her Aphrodite, the Romans called her Venus, and yet the locals still called her by her old name. Hurt, the house of Horus. The temples remained. The songs continued. The goddess as always adapted. In Alexandria, scholars tried to understand her mysteries through philosophy. They wrote of her as the divine harmony that bound heaven and earth, the unseen order behind beauty and music. To them, she was less a cow-headed goddess than an idea, a cosmic principle of love and balance. But in the villages, she was still the same gentle mother, the bringer of laughter and milk, the lady of turquoise and sunlight. It is easy to forget that Egyptian religion, even in its grandest forms, was always rooted in the daily and the tangible. The gods were not distant abstractions, they were present in the texture of ordinary life, in food, in scent, in touch. Hathor was felt whenever someone heard music, whenever someone shared a meal, or whenever the light fell warm across a face at dawn. By the 1st century BCE, her most magnificent temple, Dendera, was being rebuilt under Greek and Roman patronage. The pharaohs were long gone, but the priests of Hathor continued their work. On the walls, they carved the names of Cleopatra Vire and her son Caesarion beside those of earlier kings, as if the lineage of divine motherhood had never been interrupted. Cleopatra, in particular, embraced Hathor's imagery. In reliefs, she appears dressed as the goddess herself, crowned with the solar disk and cow horns, bearing a sistrum in her hand. To her people, this was not mere flattery, it was continuity. The queen was the earthly reflection of Hathor, radiant, nurturing, and dangerous. But Cleopatra's world was crumbling. The Roman armies advanced, and with them came a colder, more pragmatic kind of empire, one that found little use for the ancient rituals of Egypt. After her death in 30 BCE, the last link between pharaoh and goddess was severed still. For generations, the people continued to come to Dendera. Even under Roman rule, the festivals endured. Once each year, the statue of Hathor was brought from her temple to visit her consort Horus at Edfu, traveling by river in a gilded boat. Crowds gathered along the banks, singing and waving palm branches. The journey was a celebration of divine reunion, the renewal of cosmic order. The Roman administrators tolerated these processions, so long as they caused no unrest. They saw them as harmless local traditions, though they never quite understood their depth. To the Egyptians, these festivals were not just pageantry, they were the pulse of the universe. As the centuries passed, the rituals began to change. The language of the prayers shifted from Egyptian to Greek, then to Coptic. The hymns were shortened, simplified. The temple musicians dwindled in number. Some rooms fell into disuse, others were sealed as the Nile silt slowly rose. Yet in one chamber, the crypt below the sanctuary, the priests left behind carvings that spoke of both faith and farewell. The walls are covered with tiny, intricate reliefs showing the goddess being born anew from the lotus flower, rising from the primordial waters. It was a message carved for eternity. Even if the world above forgot her, Hathor would live again in the hidden places. And indeed she did, though not in the way her priests imagined. By the time Christianity took hold in Egypt, many of Hathor's qualities had quietly migrated into new forms. The Virgin Mary, like Hathor, was called the Mother of Light. Her images often showed her crowned, radiant, holding the infant in her arms. Churches were sometimes built near old Hathoric temples, reusing the same stones. The songs of praise, though rewritten, carried echoes of older rhythms. To the villagers who had sung to Hathor for generations, the transition was not a violent break. It was more like a long, slow blending, the way one river merges into another. The goddess of joy became the saint of compassion, the sistrum became the church bell. Even in the Muslim era, traces of Hathor persisted in folk beliefs. Certain shrines along the Nile were said to hold healing power for women and children. Offerings of milk and bread continued, not to a goddess now, but to unnamed spirits, the lady of the place. The divine feminine, once embodied in Hathor, had become part of the landscape itself. When the French scholars of Napoleon's expedition arrived at Dendera in 1799, they found the great temple half buried in sand. The roof was blackened by centuries of smoke from the huts of local families who had taken shelter within its walls. Yet the carvings were still sharp, the faces of the goddess still serene. On the ceiling, the blue sky of eternity remained intact, untouched by time. They called it one of the best preserved temples in Egypt, a time capsule of the last flowering of the old religion. The scholars sketched every column, every relief. They were astonished by the beauty of the carvings, by the symmetry of the hall, and by the mysterious zodiac above. But they could not feel what the ancient priests had felt. The hum of sound, the warmth of incense, the heartbeat of ritual, that had long since vanished, carried away by centuries of wind and silence. Still, as they copied the inscriptions, they noticed something curious. In several places, the texts did not praise the goddess for her power or her wrath, but for her laughter. Hathor, they realized, was not just a goddess of love. She was the personification of joy itself. Her laughter was described as a creative force, capable of reviving the sun, healing the sick, and soothing the gods. It is a rare thing in ancient religion, a divinity defined by happiness. There is an inscription in the temple that reads, "She smiles in the morning, and the world is made new. She breathes fragrance into the air, and the hearts of men are comforted." These lines, carved more than 2,000 years ago, still shimmer with tenderness. They remind us that joy, even sacred joy, was once seen as essential to the maintenance of life. The fall of Dendera's temple was gradual. Sand drifted in through the doors. The Nile shifted its course. Pilgrims stopped coming. By the 6th century CE, when Christianity had become the dominant faith, the last priests were gone. The columns stood silent, their carved faces watching over an empty sanctuary. Yet the goddess did not disappear entirely. In the quiet persistence of Egyptian culture, its songs, its art, its love of color and perfume, Hathor's presence endured. Even now, in the villages near Dendera, women decorate their homes with bright paint and hang mirrors at the door to reflect the sun. They do not think of Hathor when they do this, but the echo is unmistakable. The divine feminine, radiant and nurturing, still lives in the patterns of daily life, in the songs sung to babies, in the rhythm of drums at weddings, in the way people greet the dawn. If you stand in the great hall of Dendera today at midday, light streams down through the roof's narrow openings, striking the stone faces of Hathor. For a moment, the dust in the air seems to shimmer like gold. The columns glow softly, and the carved eyes of the goddess catch the light. It is easy to imagine that this is how it always was, that the sun, the perfume, and the laughter have never truly left. Perhaps that is the secret of Hathor. She was never a goddess of conquest or command, but of continuity. Where Isis symbolized devotion and loss, Hathor embodied the pleasure of being alive, the sacredness of beauty and sound, of human connection, of joy as an act of faith. And in the end, that may be the truest form of immortality. Because as long as someone feels warmth in the sunlight, as long as laughter rises over the sound of drums, Hathor still breathes, softly, invisibly, through the ages. She remains not in temples, but in the simple human impulse to find grace in the ordinary. You awaken to the sound of reeds brushing against one another in the morning wind. The light of the Nile filters through the thin linen walls of your quarters, pale and steady. The air smells of damp clay ink and river water. This is the world of the scribe, a world of order, repetition, and endurance. It is not the world of kings or warriors, but of those who give permanence to their deeds. To the ancient Egyptians, writing was not merely a craft. It was divine. The god Thoth, ibis-headed and serene, was believed to have invented it. He kept the records of the gods, measured time, and maintained the balance of the cosmos. To write was, in a sense, to think as Thoth thought, to bring the chaos of the world into form. The scribes were his human instruments. They were the memory of Egypt. Unlike most of their countrymen, they lived not by the hoe or the plough, but by the reed pen. Their hands, not their backs, built the kingdom. They recorded the harvests, the labor, the taxes, the births, the deaths. On papyrus and stone, they gave shape to the passing days. Their training began young. In the small chambers of temple schools, boys sat cross-legged with palettes and ink pots, copying lines from older texts onto scraps of limestone or broken pottery. Be diligent, the masters would say, for writing is more lasting than fine linen, more enduring than a monument. The student would dip his reed pen into black ink for the words themselves and into red ink for the important ones, names of gods, headings and warnings. Day after day he practiced. The letters of hieratic script, quick and flowing, became second nature. The lessons were strict and repetitive, but the rewards were great literacy, status, comfort. A famous ancient text known as the Satire of the Trades survives from one such school. It is a scribe's boast disguised as a lecture. The teacher lists all the miserable trades a man could have. The brickmaker, who spends his days in mud. The fisherman, who risks his life on the river. The soldier, who dies far from home. Be a scribe, he concludes, for it is the greatest of professions. And in a sense, he was right. A good scribe could rise high. He could serve in the temples, the royal court, or the great administrative offices. He might become overseer of granaries, keeper of records, or even vizier, the highest office under the king himself. His pen could move armies, direct taxes, and shape policy. But even at the humblest level, the scribe was essential. Without him, the vast machinery of the Egyptian state would grind to a halt. Every sheaf of grain owed to the temple, every conscript for a building project, every cow born on a noble's estate, all required documentation. The bureaucracy of Egypt was immense, layered, and precise. In a civilization that lasted over 3,000 years, its continuity depended less on kings than on clerks. Dynasties rose and fell, but the scribes remained, steady, patient, invisible. You can still see their work today carved into the walls of tombs and temples. Rows upon rows of hieroglyphs, records of offerings, inventories of furniture, lists of gifts. Each sign, carved with care, represents a thought that once passed through a human mind. One of the most famous scribes of the Old Kingdom was named Ptahhotep. He served as vizier under King Jedkar, around 2400 BCE. In his old age, he composed a book of wisdom, not about the gods or the afterlife, but about conduct, patience, and duty. He wrote, "Do not be proud of your knowledge, but consult with the ignorant and the wise. For the limits of skill are never reached, and no man has ever attained perfection. It is a quiet, almost humble philosophy, a fitting creed for those whose task was to serve through precision. If you could step into an ancient scribe's office, it would surprise you by its simplicity. A small mud brick room, a wooden chest for papyrus scrolls, and a low stool. The tools were few: a wooden palette with 2 small wells of ink, one black, one red, a bundle of cut reeds, and a cup of water to moisten the pen. The scribe sat cross-legged, balancing the scroll across his knees. The ink itself was made from soot and gum, mixed with water. The papyrus, made from the reed of the same name, was both durable and smooth, perfect for writing. Each sheet was glued to the next to form long rolls that could stretch several meters. When not in use, these scrolls were tied with linen cords and labeled with clay seals. The work was slow. Every mark mattered. There were no erasers, no second drafts. A mistake could ruin a document, or worse, bring punishment if it changed the meaning of a decree. Precision was everything. In the great temple of Karnak, dozens of scribes once worked together, copying hymns and recording offerings. The temple was not only a place of worship but also an archive, part treasury, part library. The scribes there kept track of the vast estates owned by the god Amun, recording the flow of grain, livestock, and goods from hundreds of miles around. Each year, they performed an audit known as the stretching of the cord, measuring land and comparing harvest yields. These records determined taxation and labor quotas. Through their meticulous work, the wealth of the temples, and by extension the state, remained stable. In the royal administration, things were more complex still. The palace scribes recorded everything from foreign tribute to the schedules of workers at the quarries. On some surviving ostraka, bits of limestone used for notes, we find memos, reminders, and even jokes. One reads simply, "Do not forget the lunch for the inspector of tombs." It is small details like these that make the world of the scribes feel alive. Behind the formal hieroglyphs, there were people tired, impatient, sometimes amused. And yet, they believed their work was sacred. To write was to preserve, and to preserve was to resist oblivion. The Egyptian obsession with permanence, with eternity, found its purest expression in their writing. Consider the tomb of the scribe Horemheb from the time of the New Kingdom. On his walls, he did not depict battles or conquests, but his desk, his pen, and his scrolls. The text above him reads, "I was a scribe skilled in the words of the ancestors. I caused men to know what was hidden in their hearts. My pen was my servant, my heart my ruler." He saw himself not as a bureaucrat, but as a keeper of truth. Over the centuries, the scribes became almost a class unto themselves, an invisible priesthood of literacy. Their sons inherited their trade, their techniques, their ink-stained palettes. Even when the spoken language of Egypt changed, the written one endured, frozen in sacred script. That endurance is what made Egypt different from every other civilization of its age. In Mesopotamia, scripts evolved and vanished. In Greece, writing was lost and rediscovered. But in Egypt, the scribes kept writing year after year, dynasty after dynasty, a single, unbroken line of ink across time. It is strange to think that the grand monuments of Egypt, the pyramids, the temples, the obelisks, owe their existence as much to these quiet men as to the kings who commissioned them. Without the scribes' records, the workers would not have been fed, The stones not delivered, the plans not executed. Their power lay not in their voice, but in their silence. And in a way they achieved what no pharaoh ever did, they made themselves eternal. For while the king's names are often half erased, their images defaced by rivals, the scribes' writings remain. The instructions of Ptahhotep, the maxims of Ani, the tale of the shipwrecked sailor, these texts still speak across 40 centuries. They are the walls that spoke, and still do. And perhaps that is the irony of their legacy, that those who labored to record the deeds of others ended up preserving their own. But what did it feel like to live that life? To spend your years in ink and patience, to serve a system so vast it could outlast generations? That is what we will explore next. Not the glory of the scribes, but their burden, the endless monotony, the quiet pride, and the strange kind of faith required to keep writing, even when the world changed around them. The temple courtyard is silent except for the distant rhythm of sandals on stone. The air carries the smell of ink and dust, the faint sweetness of lotus oil from the nearby shrine. Inside, under the slanted light of morning, a man sits cross-legged at a low wooden desk. His name is Nebra, a mid-level scribe in the department of temple accounts at Thebes. It is the year 1287 BCE, during the reign of Ramses II, the builder of statues, the maker of inscriptions, the man who desired to be remembered forever. Nebra's task is to make that memory possible. He has been at his post for 23 years. He records the inflow of barley, the outflow of cattle, the taxes collected from the fields, and the offerings delivered to the temple storehouses. His handwriting is steady, his back bent, his eyes tired. The tools before him, palette, reed, papyrus, have become extensions of his body. Each morning he recites a quiet prayer to Thoth, God of writing and measure, may my hand not tremble, may my ink not spill, may my words be true as the plumb line. Then, with the first mark of his reed pen, the day begins. The machinery of eternity, it is difficult to grasp the vastness of Egypt's bureaucracy. To maintain order across hundreds of miles of desert and river, thousands of officials were needed. Scribes, accountants, inspectors, and overseers. Every field, every warehouse, every fishing boat was recorded somewhere. The state depended on precision. A single miscount could ripple through the system like a flaw in a wall. If the grain tallies were off, priests would go hungry, workers unpaid, temples unserved. And so endless scrolls were filled, cross-checked and sealed. The records were divided by department. The Perhika, the house of the divine magic, kept ritual texts. The Purah, or Great House, handled royal decrees. The Pershina, the house of the storehouse, tracked provisions. The Permejat, the house of documents, was the archive, a labyrinth of shelves filled with papyrus rolls. Every level of Egyptian society was represented on those shelves. The laborers who dug canals, the farmers who paid taxes in kind, the artisans who carved reliefs, the nobles who supervised estates. Each life was translated into lines of ink, a form, a number, a signature. It was said that the gods themselves required accounting. Offerings had to be listed in exact quantities: 4 loaves of bread, 6 jars of beer, 2 calves, 1 goose. To misrecord an offering was to risk cosmic imbalance. That belief, that order on paper sustained order in heaven, gave the bureaucracy its sacred weight. In Nebra's mind, his pen maintained the universe. Every figure he copied, every seal he pressed, contributed to Ma'at, the great equilibrium. And yet, the work was unending. The days blurred together. Morning tally of the storehouse, midday verification of temple donations, evening audit of construction labor. The bureaucracy consumed time itself. The rhythm of repetition. If you walked through a scribal office during the height of Egypt's power, you would hear an unusual sound. Not silence, but the faint scratching of hundreds of reed pens. The scribes often spoke aloud as they wrote, murmuring the words under their breath to fix them in memory. The result was a constant, low hum, the voice of bureaucracy. To the untrained eye, the work looked dull, but within it lay a strange artistry. The most skilled scribes prided themselves on perfect hieratic script, flowing, balanced, elegant. The alignment of signs, the spacing of lines, even the rhythm of the strokes carried meaning. A badly written scroll could bring shame. A well-written one was a work of devotion. From time to time, an inspector would visit Nebra's office. He would unroll the scrolls, counting lines, verifying seals, comparing tallies. His reed pen hovered above the parchment like a knife. A single discrepancy, a missing measure of grain, a miscopied numeral, could lead to punishment. Not death, usually, but demotion, loss of rations, public shame. The scribes knew this, and so they double-checked everything. 2 men read the numbers aloud while a third wrote them. They sealed their scrolls with clay impressions bearing their personal marks. A tiny bird, a symbol of water, a sun disk. And yet mistakes happened. One surviving papyrus from the New Kingdom shows a dispute between two scribes over the number of oxen sent to a temple. One claimed 10, the other 12. The matter escalated to the vizier himself. His ruling is preserved. Let the inspectors of the cattle pens be summoned, and the hides be counted where they lie. It was bureaucracy at its most literal, solving problems by sheer persistence. The human side of order for Nebra. The burden of his work was not just in the numbers, but in the repetition. Every day resembled the one before. He knew the smell of ink better than the sound of his own children's laughter. His back ached from sitting, his fingers were stained black. But there was pride too. Each time a temple festival was supplied without shortage, each time the royal granaries met their quota, Nebra felt a quiet satisfaction. The system had worked. The world for another day was balanced. During festival season, when processions of priests carried statues of the gods through the streets, Nebra stood at the edge of the crowd. He did not dance or sing, that was for others. He simply watched and thought. I wrote the lists that made this possible. In the evenings, he returned to his small home on the riverbank. His wife, Hent, would be grinding grain. His children would be chasing one another in the dust. He would sit by the doorway, washing the ink from his hands, watching the light fade across the water. Sometimes he wondered what it all meant. The temples, the statues, the endless scrolls. Were they truly eternal, as the priests claimed? Or would they too crumble into dust? He once wrote, in the margin of a ledger, a name is written in ink and ink fades. But the word itself, who can erase it? That thought perhaps comforted him. Paperwork as immortality for the ancient Egyptians, writing was the bridge between life and death. To write a name was to preserve it, to erase it was to destroy it utterly. That belief extended even to bureaucracy. The scribes' lists, dull as they may seem, were acts of immortality. A farmer's name written on a tax roll might survive for millennia. The inventory of a temple offering, etched on stone, might be read thousands of years later by archaeologists under electric light. Nebra, of course, could not have imagined that. To him, the record was simply duty, but his ink became the voice of the past, the way we know Egypt not through its kings alone, but through its clerks. One such man, known only as the chief scribe of the necropolis, oversaw the building of royal tombs at Deir el-Medina. His letters, preserved on scraps of pottery, reveal the daily life of bureaucracy. Complaints about missing rations, reports of illness, requests for new sandals. In one letter, he writes to his superior, "We have not received our grain for 3 days. The men are hungry, but they continue their work. May the storerooms be opened, lest the chisels grow idle." It is a simple note, the voice of administration, yet within it lies a heartbeat of humanity. The wariness of order over time. The bureaucracy became so vast that it seemed to exist for its own sake. Decrees multiplied, copies of copies filled archives. Some scrolls were never read again after being sealed. Still, the scribes continued. To stop writing was unthinkable. The act itself was the order. But what happens when the act outlives its purpose? When temples close, when kings die, when new conquerors bring new scripts? Nebra would never see it, but the empire he served would one day fade. The ink would dry, the papyrus crumble. The language itself would vanish into mystery for centuries, unreadable until modern eyes rediscovered its meaning. And yet, when those eyes finally did, Nebra's lines, his neat, careful records, would speak again. His lists of grain, his notes on cattle, his small margin prayers, all would testify not to glory but to diligence. The silence between the lines as the sun sets over Thebes. Nebra finishes his last line of the day. He rolls the papyrus carefully, ties it with linen, and presses his seal into the damp clay. His hand trembles slightly, his eyes ache. He places the scroll on the shelf among hundreds of others. Each one looks identical, unmarked, unremarkable. Yet together they form the memory of a civilization. Outside, the river gleams in the dying light. The sound of frogs rises. Nebra dips his pen into the water to wash away the last of the ink, watching as the black swill fades downstream. Tomorrow he will begin again. The gods demand order, and order demands writing, and so he writes. Imagine a room buried beneath sand for 3,000 years. The air inside is still. On the shelves lie rolls of papyrus, their surfaces darkened and brittle. The writing that once flowed with the grace of river reeds has stiffened into fossilized lines. The men who wrote them are long gone, their voices lost to the wind that drifts across the ruins of Thebes. Yet, in a way, the scribes are still there. Every mark of ink, every line of account, was a breath of their world. When those marks were buried, so too was the quiet machinery that had kept Egypt alive for millennia. And when that machinery stopped, the civilization that depended on it began to fade. The slow collapse of order by the end of the New Kingdom, around 1070 BCE. The grand system that once kept Egypt's temples and fields synchronized began to strain. The state had grown vast and heavy, while the Nile's floods grew unpredictable. Droughts disrupted harvests, unpaid workers went on strike. A phrase almost unthinkable in a world built on obedience. The most famous of these strikes took place at Deir el-Medina. The tomb builders there, who carved the resting places of kings, stopped working and marched to demand their rations. Their complaints were written down by the very scribes who were supposed to keep order. "Why are hungry?" One record reads, "Why have not eaten for 17 days?" In those few words you can hear the cracking of a system that had lasted 1,000 years. The bureaucracy still functioned, it always did, but it now served a state in decay. Scrolls multiplied even as resources dwindled. Officials argued over inventories that no longer matched reality. Temples hoarded wealth while villages starved. Nibra's successors, if they existed, would have sat in the same cramped offices, copying figures that no longer described the world outside. The changing of scripts as foreign powers came and went. Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians. The scribal tradition bent but did not break. Each ruler recognized its power. They needed the clerks, the accountants, the keepers of the archives. Without them, Egypt could not function. But language began to shift. By the 7th century BCE, the old hieratic script, the flowing cursive used by temple scribes, gave way to demotic, a faster, more practical shorthand. It was the handwriting of merchants, tax collectors, and minor officials. The beauty of the old forms faded. Function replaced ceremony. Writing became simpler, but also less divine. Still, the scribes endured. Even under Persian rule, the bureaucrats of Egypt kept their ledgers in order, recording tribute for foreign kings just as they once had for pharaohs. The pen survived conquest, at least for a while. The Greek interlude when Alexander the Great arrived in 332 BCE. Egypt once again changed masters. The Greeks brought their own language, their own bureaucracy, and their own gods. But they too understood the value of Egyptian record-keeping. Greek administrators leaned on the native scribes to manage the countryside. Papyrus scrolls from the Ptolemaic period reveal bilingual documents. Greek on one side, Demotic on the other. Two worlds coexisting uneasily on the same sheet. One surviving contract for the sale of a donkey reads, Year 15 of Ptolemy, son of Ptolemy and Arsinoe. Written by Horus, scribe of the village. The Greek names of kings frame an Egyptian penman's work. The continuity is astonishing. The same ink, the same papyrus, the same structure of receipts and seals. Only the names at the top had changed. But change kept coming. Over the next centuries, Greek became dominant, then Latin under the Romans. The temples fell into neglect. The priests who once copied hymns to Thoth now copied tax receipts for governors in far-off capitals. The sacred art of writing was slowly reduced to paperwork again, but now without its divine purpose. The last scribes by the time of the Roman Empire, around the 3rd century CE, the old scripts were dying. Hieroglyphs, once carved proudly on temple walls, had become decorative symbols. Few could still read them. The language of the gods was becoming silence. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved on the island of Philae in 394 CE. It is brief and formal, a simple dedication to the god Osiris. After that, the voice of Egypt fell quiet. The men who followed in Nibra's tradition, those who had counted the grain, measured the cattle, written the taxes, were replaced by Greek and later Coptic clerks. Their ledgers were written on parchment instead of papyrus, their letters shaped by foreign alphabets. To them, the old writing must have seemed like the whispers of another age, beautiful but unreadable. The ink of 1,000 years had finally turned to dust. Rediscovery in silence, the desert, patient as ever, preserved what the river could not. In dry tombs and buried storehouses, the papyrus scrolls slept. When modern excavators uncovered them, they found entire archives, letters, receipts, lists of grain, tax records, all written in that neat slanting hand. Through those scraps, Nibra's world returned to light. The rediscovery began with curiosity and was completed with the Rosetta Stone, that tri-scripted decree from 196 BCE carved in Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphs. When Jean-Francois Champollion deciphered it in the 1820s, the voices of the scribes spoke again after nearly 400 years of silence. Suddenly, the boring documents that filled museum drawers were readable. Scholars realized that these were not mere scraps, but the living heart of Egypt. The paperwork that had sustained temples, paid workers, built monuments, and kept society from collapsing for 3 millennia. Nebra's careful ink lines, multiplied by thousands of others, had outlived empires. The meaning of monotony. It is tempting to think of bureaucracy as lifeless, but in ancient Egypt it was the very pulse of civilization. Every tax roll, every inventory, every list of cattle represented survival. Order in their world was not abstract. It was food on the table, ritual at the temple, stability in the flood. Even when the meaning of the words was forgotten, the act of recording itself carried on. Humans continued to count, to categorize, to make sense of the world through lists. Modern accountants, office clerks and archivists, though far removed from the temples of Thebes, carry a faint echo of those first scribes. The paperwork that shapes modern life is, in its own way, the descendant of Nebra's scrolls. The details differ, the ink is new, but the impulse is the same: to hold chaos at bay through record keeping. It is not glamorous work. It is steady, deliberate, easily overlooked, and that is precisely why it endures. Legacy of the forgotten today in museum vaults and university archives. Thousands of papyri rest under glass. Many contain nothing more than mundane lists. 2 measures of barley to Kamwaset, 1 ox for the temple of Amun, 5 days absence for the worker Hori. Yet each of these fragments is a heartbeat from the past, a trace of someone's duty, someone's mourning at the desk. If Nebra could see this, perhaps he would smile. He would see that his ink did not fade after all, it merely waited. The words that once served gods and kings now serve curiosity and learning. They teach us that civilization depends not only on conquerors and priests, but on those who wrote the receipts, who filed the copies, who maintained the invisible structure of daily life. It was they who made the empire last. And in the stillness of their work, there is something profoundly human, a kind of quiet faith that order, once written, might resist the decay of time. The room of papyrus in your imagination grows darker, dust settles. The ink, though faded, remains faintly visible, lines across centuries. Somewhere, a scholar bends over the fragment, whispering the sounds of a language resurrected from silence. The bureaucrats of Egypt are long gone, but their voices continue to murmur through time. The ink endures. The record remembers. And perhaps that is the truest immortality of all. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers move like slow veins through the flat heart of ancient Mesopotamia. Their floods, though unpredictable, bring life to the dry plains. Between them, thousands of years ago, the first cities rose: Uruk, Lagash, Kish, cities of baked brick, canals, and endless dust. It is here, around 3200 BCE, that writing begins. Not with poetry, not with philosophy or kings, but with numbers. Before humans wrote down prayers, they wrote down quantities: sheep, jars of oil, baskets of grain. And the people who did this, the world's first scribes, were not poets or prophets, they were accountants. Their office was not a temple library or royal court, but a storage yard filled with the smell of earth and livestock. The problem of memory. To understand how writing was born, you must imagine the problem it solved. Early Mesopotamian cities had grown complex. Thousands of people depended on shared irrigation, trade, and temples. Priests needed to record offerings, merchants needed to track goods, and laborers needed to be paid. At first, memory was enough. A man might remember that his neighbor owed him 5 goats or 2 jars of barley. But memory fails, especially when debts grow large and time passes. So they began to mark their memories. The earliest accountants used small clay tokens, simple shapes, each representing a commodity. A sphere might mean a jar of oil, a cone, a measure of grain, a cylinder, a sheep. These tokens could be counted, stored, and exchanged. In time, people began sealing them inside hollow clay envelopes called bulli. On the surface of each envelope, they pressed the same symbols that were inside, so the record could be read without breaking it open. And one day, we don't know when or who did it, someone realized that the marks themselves were enough. The tokens could be replaced entirely by impressions. With that, the clay tablet was born, a miracle of bureaucracy. The scribes of Uruk by 300 BCE, in the city of Uruk, one of the oldest cities on earth, scribes had developed a full system of pictographic signs pressed into wet clay using a sharpened reed stylus. The reed left a wedge-shaped mark. The word cuneiform comes from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. These were the first accountants, the first record keepers of human civilization. Their work was not glorious. They sat on the ground or on low benches, hunched over clay tablets that dried in the sun. The tablets recorded deliveries of barley, beer, and livestock. Each entry followed a formula: 5 measures of barley, delivered to the temple granary, 3 jars of beer, distributed to workers on the canal. The writing was limited, but it was enough. With it, the temples and storehouses of Europe could coordinate thousands of laborers and manage vast networks of trade. The city as ledger, the city itself functioned like an enormous accounting book. At its center stood the temple of Inanna, goddess of love and war, a white ziggurat rising above the mud brick roofs. Around it, workshops produced textiles, pottery, and tools. Farmers brought in their crops, shepherds their flocks, and fishermen their catch. In return, the temple distributed food, clothing, and beer. Every exchange was recorded on clay. Over time, the records grew. Whole rooms were filled with tablets, stacks upon stacks of baked earth, each one a single line of history. Some tablets were temporary, dried in the sun and later broken once the transaction was complete. Others were fired hard in ovens, either intentionally for permanence or accidentally when buildings burned. Those are the ones archaeologists find today, still legible after 5,000 years. If papyrus was fragile memory, clay was eternal record. A day in the life of a Sumerian accountant, you can picture one of these early scribes. The sun has barely risen over the flat horizon. The air smells of wet clay and smoke from morning fires. He sits at a low table beside a storehouse wall, a lump of fine river clay before him. His stylus, a trimmed reed, cut to a flat edge, is ready in his hand. A merchant approaches, leading a line of donkeys loaded with sacks. He bows slightly and recites his delivery. The scribe listens, counts, and begins to write. Each wedge pressed into the clay is deliberate and of 5 measures of barley. The scribe adds the date, the recipient, and the seal of the temple. Then he smooths the tablet's edge with his thumb and sets it aside to dry. By midday he has written 10 or 12 tablets, his hands coated in dust and clay. He pauses to drink from a jar of beer, thick, fermented, and drunk through a straw. The work is not poetic, it is patient, repetitive, precise, and yet it is the foundation of everything that follows. Writing, numbers, contracts, property, all grow from this act of pressing reeds into mud. When clay became speech at first, the mark stood only for quantities and goods. But as cities grew, scribes needed to record more complex ideas, who gave what to whom and why. To represent names, they began using signs for syllables rather than whole objects. A new world opened. Symbols that once stood for sheep or grain could now represent sounds. Lo could mean great. Gal could mean great. Together, gal, they meant great man or king. The accountants had accidentally invented language on clay. Soon, their ledgers became not just lists but stories. Scribes recorded hymns, myths, and proverbs alongside inventories and taxes. The temple's bureaucracy had given birth to literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's first great story, emerged from the same script that had once tracked barley rations. The line between record and revelation blurred. Order in mud, but make no mistake, the core of Mesopotamian writing remained administrative. Even the king's grand inscriptions, their boasts of conquest and temple building, were, at heart, public records. Every tablet was a statement of order. Every mark of the stylus was an attempt to fix a moment in time. For the Sumerians, writing was divine, but not in the sense of beauty. It was divine because it made the world measurable. The god Nabu, later worshipped by the Babylonians, was the patron of scribes. His symbol was a stylus on a tablet. In his temples, priests kept archives of royal decrees and celestial omens. To record was to serve the gods. It is said that when Nabu wrote the destiny of men, he did it not with words of power, but with numbers, calculating, balancing, correcting. Even the universe, they believed, could be audited. The weight of permanence, unlike papyrus, clay endures. The Sumerian scribes may not have meant their records to last millennia, but they did. Each fired tablet is a fossilized thought, a trace of human intention that the earth could not erase. Modern archaeologists find them by the thousands, in storerooms, rubbish pits, collapsed temples. Many contain nothing more than lists: 10 she-goats delivered to the priest of Nana, or 1 ox and 3 measures of beer for the festival of Inanna. Dull, perhaps, yet through them, the rhythm of ancient life emerges. We can see how much a worker was paid, how many rations a family received, even the cost of a hired boat. From this tangle of clay and numbers, historians have rebuilt entire economies. Civilization in its earliest form was a matter of accounting. A quiet revolution, it's easy to overlook how profound this was. The act of writing did not begin with imagination, but with the need to keep track, to remember, to measure, to ensure fairness and debt. The first human words were not love poems or heroic boasts. They were inventory. And yet, that inventory changed the world. Because once you can record a transaction, you can build a contract. Once you can build a contract, you can create laws. Once you have laws, you can create states. From clay tablets came kings. The pause before continuation, as the scribe of Uruk lays down his stylus for the day. He looks over his work. Rows of marks drying in the sun, each representing a transaction completed, a memory made tangible. He cannot know that 5,000 years later, those same marks will be deciphered by scholars who no longer remember his name, reading aloud the words he pressed into mud. He only knows that tomorrow will bring more grain, more sheep, more clay. The clay will remember, even if he does not. The land between the rivers, Mesopotamia, was not kind. It gave life through its floods, but it also destroyed with them. The Tigris and Euphrates were unpredictable, carving and shifting, sometimes blessing, sometimes drowning. To survive, people needed order. They found that order not in kings or warriors, but in counters, in the men and women who recorded what was sown, what was reaped, what was owed. Civilization, it turns out, was born not from conquest but from bookkeeping. The city as machined by 3000 BCE, the city of Uruk had become a world unto itself. Tens of thousands of people bound together by canals, temples, and trade. It was not just a collection of buildings, it was a system. The Sumerians had invented something no one had ever attempted before: large-scale, collective cooperation. Every farmer, potter shepherd, and fisherman played a role in keeping the city alive. The temple stood at the center, not only as a house of worship, but as a kind of administrative engine. Here, scribes tallied every offering and ration, using the same wedge-shaped marks across endless tablets. One scholar once described the Sumerian temple as half warehouse, half cathedral. That is true, but it was also an office. The birth of the bureaucrat, the scribe, once a simple recorder of goods, now became something more: a bureaucrat. He did not simply write, he managed. His tablets decided how much barley a laborer would eat, how many oxen were assigned to plow a field, how much silver a merchant would owe. His stylus held power greater than a soldier's spear. In the courtyard of the temple, caravans arrived daily. Donkeys bearing copper from Oman, timber from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Each delivery passed under the eye of the scribes. They weighed, measured, sealed, and recorded. The information flowed like the river itself, from one tablet to another, from one hand to the next. To modern eyes, it was paperwork. To the Sumerians, it was civilization. The god of the ledger, every system needs faith to sustain it. The Mesopotamians found theirs in the gods of record-keeping. Among them, Nabu became the divine patron of scribes. He carried a tablet and stylus, just like his human counterparts. It was believed that during the New Year festival, he wrote down the fates of kings and kingdoms for the coming year. To write, then, was sacred. Each stroke of the stylus was an imitation of divine order, bringing chaos into form. In temples, scribes prayed before beginning work. They washed their hands, murmured invocations, and then pressed the wet clay. To make a mistake in a royal inscription or a tax record was not merely an error, it was impiety. In Mesopotamia, precision was holy. The counting of people, it wasn't long before clay tablets were used not just for goods, but for people. The temples needed workers, farmers to sow, shepherds to tend, laborers to dig canals. These people were organized into groups, each managed through lists and rations. A tablet might record 30 men, barley workers. Rations 1 measure per day. 10 women, cloth weavers. Rations 2 jars of beer. Each person became a number, each number a line of clay. For the first time in history, humans began to live inside systems of written control. The scribes of Uruk had invented what we now call administration. It was efficient, but also inescapable. The first taxes with order came obligation. The city provided irrigation, protection, and food, but it also demanded return. The earliest taxes were offerings to the gods, paid in barley, sheep, or labor. But soon these offerings became mandatory. Clay tablets list the quotas owed by each farmer and craftsman. Inspectors traveled through the countryside to ensure compliance. A bad harvest might earn mercy or punishment. From these taxes, temples and palaces grew rich. Their storerooms overflowed with grain, silver, and livestock. The wealth built walls, hired soldiers, and fed the priests who interpreted divine will. The first kings rose not from warlords, but from temple administrators, men who learned to rule through paperwork. From temples to palaces by 2600 BCE, the balance of power began to shift. Temples, once the centers of authority, were joined, and sometimes overshadowed, by palaces. The kings of cities like Ur and Lagash took control of the scribes and the system they managed. The king became the living embodiment of order, the human Nabu, the earthly accountant of divine justice. Royal archives appeared beside temple ones. Each contained thousands of tablets, records of taxes, decrees, and trade agreements. For the first time, writing became political. A king's legitimacy depended on his scribes. His victories were recorded in cuneiform, his decrees impressed upon clay, his name repeated until it echoed through the ages. Writing, once a tool of economy, had become the language of power. The machinery of control, the Mesopotamian bureaucracy, was astonishingly complex. Each transaction passed through layers of verification: the worker, the overseer, the accountant, the chief scribe, and finally the temple or palace seal. Each tablet bore marks of approval: fingerprints, cylinder seals, witness names. Errors could be punished severely. A miscounted ration was not merely a mistake, but a potential offense against the gods. The system was both rigid and resilient. It could survive famine, war, and even the death of a ruler, because the clay never forgot. In one archive from the city of Ebla, archaeologists discovered over 17,000 tablets, perfectly preserved. Many were receipts and lists, but others contained correspondence between rulers, treaties, and diplomatic exchanges. Through these, we see the first glimpses of international relations, alliances recorded not in trust but in cuneiform. The scribes' schools: to sustain this machine, scribes had to be trained. By 2500 BCE, schools known as adubus houses existed across Sumer. Young boys, sometimes from noble families, sometimes from humble ones, spent years learning the art of the stylus. Their lessons were strict. Teachers, known as ummiyah, ruled with reeds in hand, both to write and to discipline. Students copied model texts for hours, practicing lists of signs, proverbs, and hymns. One exercise tablet reads, "A lazy student, his teacher will beat him." Another says, "The beginning of wisdom is the stylus." Scribes graduated into temple or palace service, often spending their lives surrounded by clay, reed, and silence. They were not heroes in the traditional sense, yet they held the keys to civilization. The empire of inkless words, as Mesopotamian cities grew into kingdoms, and kingdoms into empires, the system of record keeping expanded with them. The Akkadian Empire under Sargon around 2300 BCE adopted the Sumerian system and spread it across the Near East. Cuneiform became the shared language of power, a script that crossed boundaries of culture and tongue. Merchants from Syria to Elam used it for trade. Diplomats in Egypt and Hatti used it for treaties. Even distant kings corresponded in cuneiform, using scribes trained in the ancient art of the wedge. It was, in a sense, the world's first written network, a clay web binding empires together. The cost of order, but bureaucracy, for all its efficiency, has a cost. The same system that allowed civilization to flourish also constrained it. Each person's life, their labor, food, and movement was quantified, regulated, and stored. In the tablets of Lagash, we find complaints from workers who received less than their rations, disputes between farmers over land, accusations of theft or underpayment. The scribes recorded these too, but always from the perspective of authority. The system listened only to itself. When droughts struck or rivers shifted, when people rebelled or fled, the clay remained indifferent. It simply recorded. The accountants of Mesopotamia had given humanity the gift of memory, but also the burden of structure, the shape of things to come, and 5,000 years later, we still live in their shadow. Every receipt, every contract, every spreadsheet is a descendant of those first tablets. Every bureaucracy, from government offices to multinational corporations, still echoes the rhythm of Sumerian record-keeping. Civilization, in the end, is a story of counting. It is said that when the scribes of Uruk first pressed a stylus into clay, they thought they were solving a small problem: how to track grain and goats. What they created instead was a new kind of world, one that could not exist without writing, without measurement, without records. And so, beneath every skyscraper and server farm, in every archive and database, there lies a ghost of the Sumerian accountant, a quiet figure with clay on his hands and order in his heart. Would you like to move on to Section 3? The words that outlived empires, how clay preserved the ancient mind. That part will explore how these records became humanity's first archives, how clay tablets survived the fall of cities and allowed modern archaeologists to read the thoughts of a civilization long turned to dust. When the last scribes of Babylon pressed their final wedges into clay, they could not have imagined who would read them next. They worked in flickering light, recording taxes, rituals, and dreams, unaware that their words would one day rest in glass cases beneath electric lamps, studied by people who no longer knew the names of their gods. It began as practical writing: barley, oxen, wages. But what was preserved became a memory of thought itself. In the end, clay outlasted kings. the silence after collapse, as civilizations rarely die all at once. They fade, like lights slipping through dust. Around 2000 BCE, the great Sumerian cities declined. The rivers that had nourished them shifted course. Invasions swept through the plains. The trade routes faltered. Temples were abandoned, canals clogged with silt. But in their ruins, the tablets remained. Clay, once soft and malleable, hardened in fire and time. Some tablets were deliberately baked for durability. Others were baked accidentally when the cities that held them burned. A library may perish in flames, but a clay archive, paradoxically, is preserved by it. And so, long after the priests and accountants were gone, their voices endured in neat, silent rows beneath layers of soil. The rediscovery of words millennia later. In the 19th century, the deserts of Mesopotamia drew explorers, scholars and adventurers armed with shovels and notebooks. They came seeking the lost cities of the Bible, Nineveh, Babylon, Ur. What they found instead was an ocean of clay. At first, the tablets were a mystery. Thousands of small, brown rectangles covered in strange marks, meaningless to modern eyes. Some were as small as a palm, others as large as a brick. Most were mundane receipts, lists, inventories. But as more were uncovered, patterns began to emerge. The wedge-shaped impressions repeated with consistency. These were not decorations, they were words. Scholars called them cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. Deciphering them took decades. It required linguists who knew Akkadian, scholars who compared signs across tablets, and even copies of royal inscriptions that bore bilingual text, one in cuneiform, the other in Old Persian or Greek. In 1857, 4 scholars, working independently, translated the same cuneiform text and produced nearly identical results. For the first time in over 2,000 years, the language of the Sumerians and Akkadians was heard again. And so, the accountants of Uruk, the kings of Akkad, and the poets of Babylon began to speak once more. The libraries of clay. Among the most astonishing discoveries was the library of Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, at Nineveh. When British excavators uncovered it in the 1850s, they found over 30,000 tablets neatly stored, royal decrees, medical texts, hymns, dictionaries, even omens and myths. Ashurbanipal had been a learned ruler, proud of his literacy. He declared himself the one who understands the tablets of the gods. Under his reign, scribes gathered texts from across the empire, creating what was perhaps the world's first comprehensive library. When Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, the palace burned. But again, the fire hardened the clay. What should have been destruction became preservation. It is from these tablets that we know of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's oldest surviving great story. In that epic, the ancient king of Uruk searches for immortality, only to learn that no man can live forever. Only the memory of his deeds endures. The irony is profound. It was not Gilgamesh's deeds that survived, but the words of the scribes who wrote them. Everyday eternity. Not all tablets held grand tales. Most, in fact, were profoundly dull. A shipment of dates, a record of taxes paid, a contract for a loan of silver, a list of temple rations. But it is precisely these small records that tell us the most. Through them, historians have reconstructed the rhythms of daily life: wages, prices, family names, even personal disputes. One tablet from Nippur records a loan between 2 merchants. Another, from Ur, lists a woman's dowry in exquisite detail: 2 bronze bracelets, 1 linen tunic, 1 jar of oil, 4 measures of barley. Each item, each name, connects us to real people who once lived, worked, argued, and loved. Their lives would have been lost without the patience of their record keepers. We often imagine history as the story of kings, but clay remembers everyone: the accountant, the shepherd, the woman who signed her dowry with a cylinder seal. The memory of bureaucracy. To modern minds, bureaucracy feels suffocating: forms, rules, signatures. But in Mesopotamia it was a form of immortality. To be recorded was to exist beyond your own death. Your name, your transaction, your plea to the gods, all impressed into clay, waiting to be rediscovered. Some tablets even record prayers to the gods to remember the scribe's name, and the gods, in a sense, did. Clay was not a fragile medium. It resisted time better than papyrus, parchment, or even stone. Thousands of years later, the names remain sharp. The accountants of Mesopotamia achieved a kind of eternity not through monuments, but through documentation. The layers of memory today. The world's museums hold hundreds of thousands of these tablets. In London, Paris, Berlin, Baghdad, only a fraction have been translated. The rest wait silent, in drawers and archives. Each one is a tiny echo of the ancient mind. Some still bear fingerprints. The human touch of a scribe smoothing the clay, the curve of his nail, the accidental brush of his hand. If you look closely, you can sometimes see the slight tremor of hesitation before a sign or a correction made by pressing a new wedge over an old one. These are the earliest traces of human thought made permanent. Archaeologists often describe the feeling of holding one of these tablets for the first time, the realization that it was last touched by someone 5 millennia ago, someone who paused, breathed, and carefully inscribed the same words you now read. It is, they say, like shaking hands with the past. From clay to code, our own world is built on records. Not clay, but code. We no longer press reeds into wet earth, we press keys into glass. The tablets are gone, but the impulse remains. We still write to remember, we still record to manage, to prove, to preserve. Somewhere in a distant future, when archaeologists uncover our devices, perhaps they will find traces of the same thing: lists, ledgers, messages. The small evidences of daily order. It may seem mundane, but it is the foundation of memory. Civilization, it seems, has always depended on boredom, on the slow, deliberate act of writing things down. The final lesson of clay. When we look at the tablets of Mesopotamia, we see more than marks. We see the birth of abstraction, the leap from counting sheep to representing sound, from quantity to language, was one of the greatest intellectual transformations in human history. It required imagination to believe that a sign could stand for a word, and that a word could preserve a thought beyond the speaker's life. That idea changed everything. It allowed laws, poetry, and history to exist. It allowed contracts to outlast memory, and promises to survive generations. It allowed a civilization to continue speaking long after its temples turned to dust. The accountants of Mesopotamia may never have dreamed of immortality, but they created it. The whisper beneath the sand, in the museum quiet, the tablets seem lifeless. But if you could listen closely enough, perhaps you would hear them hum. The murmur of numbers, of names, of prayers. You might hear a scribe sighing as he corrects a column, or the soft scrape of a reed on clay. You might hear the voices of merchants bargaining, priests chanting, children reciting signs in a school courtyard. They are gone now, but their words are not. The clay still speaks, and in that silence, beneath layers of time, one lesson endures. Civilization does not remember through glory or conquest. It remembers through record. What we write we keep, what we keep we become. The rest, the battles, the kings, the floods, fade back into sand. Only the clay endures. If you were to stand on the banks of the Nile some 5,000 years ago, you would see a landscape that pulsed like a living heart. Every year as the star Sirius rose just before dawn, the river swelled, bursting its banks, spilling life into the waiting fields. To the Egyptians, this was not chance. It was order, divine, predictable, and eternal. They did not see time as a straight line, but as a circle, endlessly repeating. The flood, the planting, the harvest. These were not seasons, they were the heartbeat of creation itself. And so, they began to count. The invention of the Egyptian year long, before the pyramids were built, farmers along the Nile noticed that the river's flood coincided with the heliacal rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the sky. This moment, when the star first appeared just before sunrise, became the anchor of their world. They called the star Sopdet. We call it Sirius. She was a goddess, the herald of inundation, the bringer of life. From her rising, they built a calendar 12 months of 30 days, plus 5 sacred days added to complete a 365-day year. This was one of humanity's first solar calendars. It was astonishingly precise, off by only a quarter of a day each year. That small error meant that over centuries the calendar drifted. The new year no longer matched the flood, and so priests tracked a cycle of 1 for 60 years, the time it took for the calendar and the star to realign. To them, this was not a flaw. It was proof that all things, even time itself, returned to their beginning. The rhythm of the river, the Egyptians divided the year into 3 great seasons: Akhet, the season of inundation, when the Nile rose; Peret, the season of emergence, when the waters withdrew and crops began to grow; Shimu, the season of harvest, when the fields turned golden and the stores filled. Each season held 4 months, each month 3 weeks, each week 10 days. The rhythm was unbroken. Time was measured not by minutes or seconds, but by cycles of moon, sun, river, and work. Each day, priests observed the heavens, noting the movement of stars across the sky. The temples of Karnak and Abu Simbel were aligned so that, on specific days, sunlight would pierce deep into their sanctuaries, illuminating the gods within. Time itself, they believed, was light, the sun's path written across stone. The first clocks, but it was not enough to count years and months. The Egyptians sought to measure the passage of each day, to bring order even to the hours. They invented devices to track time's flow. Shadow clocks, or gnomons, marked the sun's movement across the sky. Merkets, simple plumb lines, were used at night to align with circumpolar stars, the undying stars that never set. Water clocks, or clepsydrae, used the steady dripping of water to divide hours in darkness. One such water clock, found in Karnak, still bears markings that correspond to 12 divisions, the ancient Egyptian hours of the night. To us, these inventions seem primitive, but to them, they were sacred. Measuring time was not curiosity, it was devotion. Each moment was an offering to Ra, the sun god, who sailed his boat across the sky by day and through the underworld by night. If the priests failed to observe his rising correctly, if they lost track of his journey, the balance of the cosmos, Ma'at, might falter. The time of gods and kingshins, the Egyptians did not see a separation between divine time and human time. Each ruler was woven into the fabric of eternity. When a new pharaoh took the throne, a new era began. Literally, years were counted not in absolute terms, but as the first year of the reign of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt. Thus, each reign reset the calendar. The passage of time was tied to the vitality of the king. In this way, the pharaoh became a living clock, his life a measure of cosmic stability. When he died, time paused. The funerary rituals of 40 and 70 days were not arbitrary, they echoed celestial movements. The rising and setting of certain stars, the lunar phases tied to rebirth. Even the construction of pyramids followed cosmic alignment, their sides facing the cardinal points, their passages aimed towards specific constellations. To build a tomb was to synchronize human existence with the heavens. The eternal present, unlike us, the Egyptians did not fear the past, nor long for the future. Their world was the eternal present, Nile, the time that renews itself. They believed that the gods reenacted creation each dawn. The sun did not rise because of physics. It rose because Ra defeated darkness once more. This victory had to be assisted through ritual. In temples, priests performed daily ceremonies that mirrored the divine cycle. Washing, anointing, feeding the god's statue as if ensuring the very motion of the sun. If neglected, the world could slip back into chaos, into isfet, disorder. Time, therefore, was not passive, it required participation. Each morning was the first morning, each flood the first flood, each harvest the first harvest. The universe was reborn endlessly, sustained by remembrance. Counting as worship to us. Counting feels mechanical. To the Egyptians it was mystical. Priests who tracked the hours of the night did so by reciting hymns to the stars. Those who measured the flood's height did so in sacred chambers, the nilometers, carved with inscriptions and watched by temple officials. When the waters reached the proper mark, they declared the festival of Opet, when Amun, Mut, and Khunsu were carried through the city in great processions. Timekeeping was not separation from the divine but communion with it. In their system, the boundary between mathematics and magic dissolved. The calendar of the dead, their understanding of time extended even beyond life. In tombs, the Book of the Dead guided souls through the hours of the night. 12 gates, 12 hours, each guarded by different deities. The journey of the deceased mirrored that of the sun, death, descent, and renewal. Each hour was marked by spells and instructions describing rivers of fire, fields of reeds, and stars that never die. To complete this journey was to join the eternal cycle, to become one with Ra, reborn each dawn. Even death in Egypt was not an end but a transition of time. Time written in stone, every temple, every monument, every inscription in Egypt was an attempt to freeze motion. The walls of Karnak, Luxor, and Abydos were carved not to decorate, but to preserve the rhythm of ritual, the correct way to keep the world turning. The hieroglyph for time itself combined symbols for sun, movement, and repetition, an acknowledgement that eternity was not stillness, but perpetual renewal. The great obelisks of Heliopolis and Thebes were more than monuments. Their pointed tips caught the first light of dawn, serving as giant sun clocks, frozen rays of sunlight carved from granite. In them, time stood both still and alive. The philosophy of forever to the Egyptian mind, there were two kinds of time: Nihi, the cyclical ever-renewing time of the sun, the seasons and human life. Dejet, the unchanging, completed time of the gods beyond decay. A pharaoh's tomb inscriptions often invoked both. May your Nihi be endless, your Jet eternal. This was their version of immortality, not infinite progression, but eternal recurrence. Where we see time as a line, they saw it as a wheel. The first historians of the sun in later periods, priests like those of Heliopolis, became astronomers in all but name. They tracked the rising of stars with astonishing accuracy, predicting eclipses, solstices, and the return of Sopdet. Their records, inscribed on temple walls, became the foundation for later Greek and Roman chronologies. Even the Julian calendar, ancestor of the one we use today, owes its structure to Egyptian reckoning. Our leap years, our 365-day count, our division of the day into 24 hours, all are descendants of the Nile's rhythm. Time as we know it began in Egypt. The quiet legacy today, when we glance at a clock, we rarely think of rivers, floods, or stars. But the logic that orders our lives, the year, the month, the hour, was first written in stone beside the Nile. The Egyptians built not only pyramids but the architecture of time itself. And even now, when the star Sirius rises each summer, invisible to most eyes, it still keeps the same rhythm, whispering the ancient promise of renewal. The world has changed, but the river still flows, the sun still returns, and somewhere, unseen, the old calendar continues to turn. Time, they would say, has never truly moved forward. It only circles quietly forever. When you walk through the ruins of Egypt, it is easy to think of them as silent, as relics of a vanished people. But the truth is, the temples were designed to move. Not in space, of course, but in light. The Egyptians used the sun itself as a builder, crafting walls and corridors that came alive only at certain moments. Dawns, solstices, and sacred days, when sunlight would fall upon the faces of gods deep within the darkness. To the modern eye, this seems like coincidence. But to them, it was precision, a harmony between heaven and earth. The architecture of alignment at first glance, Egyptian temples seem chaotic, vast courtyards, thick columns, endless walls covered in hieroglyphs. Yet every line was deliberate. The axis of each temple, its long central passage, was aligned with a specific celestial event. At the Temple of Amun, Ra in Karnak, this alignment pointed to the sunrise on the winter solstice. Once a year at dawn, sunlight would pierce through the successive gates and halls, illuminating the innermost shrine where the god's statue was kept. This was not a mere coincidence of geography. It was an act of cosmic engineering. The architects, guided by priest astronomers, would observe the rising sun for months, marking its movement against the horizon until they found the exact point of alignment. Then, and only then, would they begin to build. Every block that followed, every carved lintel, had to maintain that line, not simply for beauty, but for eternity. The result was breathtaking, a temple that became a living instrument, measuring not hours but moments of divine renewal. Light and shadow as ritual, Egyptian architecture was not meant to be fully seen. Most of it was in shadow, a progression from open courtyards into darker and darker chambers. This mirrored the sun's daily journey, from the brightness of noon to the deep darkness of the underworld. Visitors to the temple would walk this path as though traveling through creation itself. At the outer gates, sunlight flooded the space. Deeper in, columns thick as trees filtered the light into thin shafts, patterned like the rays of dawn through a forest. And at the heart of it all, the sanctuary of the god, there was almost total darkness. Until, on the right day, the right moment, the first light of morning reached in and touched the god's statue. It was the physical embodiment of Mut, balance, order, and truth. The priests timed their rituals to these beams. When the sun entered the sanctuary, they performed the daily awakening of the god, opening the shrine doors, anointing the statue, and offering incense. The god woke, as the world did, and then, just as slowly, the light retreated. The ceremony was complete. The temple had performed its function, not as a place of worship, but as a cosmic machine. Abu Simbel, the monument that marks the sun far to the south, near the border of Nubia, stands the great temple of Abu Simbel, built by Pharaoh Ramses II, carved directly into a cliff. Its entrance is guarded by 4 colossal statues of the pharaoh himself, each more than 60 feet tall. But it is the temple's interior that holds its true secret. Twice a year, on February 22 and October 22, the rising sun penetrates the long entrance hall and illuminates the statues within. 3 of them glow with golden light, Ramses himself, and the gods Amun and Ra-Horakhti. But the 4th statue, that of Pa, the god of darkness, remains forever in shadow. This alignment is so precise that even when the temple was relocated in the 1960s to save it from the rising waters of the Aswan Dam, engineers had to reconstruct the entire mountain around it to preserve that exact solar path. To the Egyptians, these moments were not astronomical curiosities. They were divine appointments. The light entering the sanctuary symbolized the pharaoh's union with the gods, the reaffirmation of his right to rule, and the renewal of the cosmos itself. In that brief flash of light, heaven and earth were once again aligned. The pyramids as cosmic coordinates, the oldest and most famous of Egypt's monuments, the pyramids, also followed this logic of alignment. At Giza, the Great Pyramid of Khufu is oriented with astonishing accuracy to the cardinal points, north, south, east, and west. Its deviation from true north is less than 1/20th of a degree, a precision unmatched for millennia. How did they do it? Recent studies suggest they used the circumpolar stars, the ones that never set, as guides. By marking the midpoint between two opposite stars as they revolved around the North Star's empty space, they could find true north with astonishing accuracy. The pyramid's internal shafts are also angled towards specific constellations, Orion and the North Star, linking the pharaoh's tomb to the heavens. This was not random symbolism. To the Egyptians, Orion represented Osiris, god of resurrection, while the circumpolar stars symbolized eternity. Thus, the pyramid became a celestial machine, guiding the dead king's soul to join the gods in the sky. The temples as calendars. If pyramids measured the permanence of kingship, temples measured the passage of days and years. The priests of Dendera, for instance, created a massive circular zodiac, carved into the ceiling of the Hathor temple, that charted the stars and planetary cycles. It is one of the earliest known celestial maps. Constellations are shown as animals and figures. The zodiac signs appear centuries before the Greeks adopted them. Each temple contained multiple layers of time, the daily rituals that mirrored the sun's path, the annual festivals aligned to the agricultural and solar calendar, the eternal cycles, engraved in stone, connecting temple events to the heavens. In this way, Egyptian priests managed a kind of cosmic bureaucracy, a scheduling of the universe itself. They did not separate astronomy from religion or architecture from theology. For them, they were the same. The labor of measuring forever. Behind this grandeur were thousands of ordinary workers, quarrymen, surveyors, and builders, each playing a part in maintaining cosmic order. The surveyors used simple tools, knotted cords, plumb lines, leveling instruments made of wood. Yet their measurements governed the alignment of monuments that still confound modern engineers. Each morning, they performed rituals before beginning their work, calling on Thoth, the god of wisdom, to bless their calculations. The work was slow, methodical, and deeply sacred. Every stone had to fit precisely. Every column had to follow the rhythm of proportion, a geometry that echoed the cycles of the heavens. Even the colors of the walls were symbolic: blue for the sky, green for rebirth, red ochre for the vitality of the sun. When the light of dawn struck these pigments, the walls shimmered as though alive. For a few minutes each morning, the temple was not stone but cosmos, time. Measured in silence, the modern visitor sees ruins, columns toppled, colors faded, the silence heavy. But in their time, these places were alive with sound, chants, drums, the low hum of priests reciting hymns in rhythm with the sun's movement. Each temple was a clock that chimed not with bells, but with light and song. The priests watched the stars from the temple roof, using their merkets to note when the circumpolar constellations reached their zenith. These observations were then used to mark the passing of hours through the night, not by numbers but by verses of prayer. Every hour was a hymn, every dawn a resurrection. The people of Egypt did not measure time to control it. They measured it to remember that the world was built in order, that the sun would always rise, that even death itself was but a pause in the rhythm of the universe. Architecture as memory, temples like Luxor, Edfu, and Philae were expanded over centuries, each pharaoh adding new walls, new courtyards, new inscriptions. This was not simply vanity, it was continuity, a physical manifestation of Nihi, the eternal present. By adding to the work of predecessors, each ruler renewed the link between past and present, between gods and men. The temple became a layered memory of time itself, each addition preserving the sacred rhythm. When you stand in Luxor today and look along the great avenue of sphinxes, you are seeing not a ruin, but a frozen calendar, one that once pulsed with light and procession. The shadow of change, yet even the most eternal structures could not escape the slow drift of time. The temples, built for the solstices and star risings, began to fall out of sync as the Earth's axis shifted, a process we now call precession. The light that once entered a sanctuary on the perfect day began to miss its mark by inches, then feet, then more. To the priest, this was not a mechanical accident. It was a sign, a warning that divine balance needed renewal. So they built new temples, new alignments, new calendars, adjusting eternity to fit the heavens once more. It was a quiet confession: even eternity needs maintenance. And so the work continued, generation after generation, to hold the sun steady in stone. When the last priests of Egypt closed their temple doors under Roman rule, they did so with a sense of duty fulfilled. They had counted the days, measured the stars, and built the architecture of forever. But time, their time, was about to change. For beyond the desert horizon, New ways of marking life were coming: mechanical clocks, calendars ruled by emperors, and a world that would soon think of time not as a circle, but as a line. And yet, somewhere beneath the sand, their stones still catch the sunlight as they once did, just for a moment, on the same days, in the same way as 5,000 years ago. Imagine the last light falling on the temple walls at Philly. The priests, their heads shaved and robes white, carry out their duties for the final time. The incense burns, the hymns echo softly through the stone halls, and outside, the Nile flows on steady, indifferent. They still watch the sky for the rising of Sirius, still mark the sacred day when light enters the sanctuary, but fewer people come now. The language of the hymns is older than the people who recite them. The gods are older still. Beyond the river, new rulers sit in Alexandria, men who speak Greek, not Egyptian. Their philosophers see time not as a circle but as a sequence, a movement from beginning to end. The heavens are no longer gods but mechanisms, and yet for a while the old rhythm continues. The Greek-Egypt time rewritten in two languages. When Alexander the Great entered Egypt in 332 BCE, he found a land already ancient, its temples older than his entire civilization. But he understood power, and power required symbols. He had himself declared the son of a moon, the same title once used by pharaohs. His successors, the Ptolemies, continued this tradition, blending Greek and Egyptian beliefs into something new, part divine, part rational. Under their rule, timekeeping evolved once again. The Greeks brought with them an interest in precision. Sundials carved with mathematical ratios, mechanical water clocks that could sound a tone every hour. In Alexandria, the great scholar Ctesibius built a water clock that used gears and floats to measure time automatically, one of the first mechanical devices in history. To an Egyptian priest, this would have been wondrous but also strange. The clock did not follow the Nile or the stars, it obeyed its own rhythm, independent of the heavens. It ticked in seconds, not in seasons. The transformation had begun. Time was being unbound from nature. The Library of Alexandria, where the sky became numbers in the same city, other minds were turning the heavens into geometry. Men like Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the earth, and Hipparchus, who charted the stars and discovered precession, the slow wobble of the earth's axis that the Egyptians had noticed but never explained. For the first time, the movements of the heavens were treated not as sacred performances, but as patterns to be measured. The priests of Heliopolis had long observed the stars to honor them. Now, the scholars of Alexandria observed them to predict them. Eternity was still there, but it was being redefined as symmetry, not divinity. The star Sirius, once the herald of the Nile, became a data point in celestial maps. The cycles of Nehe and Djet gave way to the abstractions of mathematics. The gods receded into silence, replaced by numbers that moved without will or emotion. It was perhaps the greatest conceptual shift in the history of time. The Roman inheritance. When the Romans came, they did not destroy the Egyptian sense of order, they absorbed it. The Egyptian civil calendar, with its 365 days and 5 epigomenal extra days, became the foundation for the Julian calendar, introduced by Julius Caesar in 45 BCE. Caesar, advised by the Alexandrian astronomer Sosigenes, reformed Rome's chaotic lunar system into a solar one, based on the Egyptian model. For the first time in Western history, time was standardized, months fixed, leap years added, the year itself aligned with the sun. The Egyptian idea of counting the year by the heavens, once a sacred act, had now become administration. Empires ran on the same cycles that once belonged to the gods. It was efficiency, but it was also a kind of loss. The priests at Thebes no longer decided the sacred days.